Hello and welcome to this bite-sized webinar series. My name is Hannah Williams and I am part of the consultancy team at the Compliance People. And today I'll be talking to you all about legal registers. I will be covering what a legal register is, why organisations need one, and what a good quality legal register should contain. I will then show you what a good quality legal register looks like using our Legislation Update Service legal register functionality. And throughout the webinar, I'm going to be making links to how we've developed our legal registers to help subscribers meet the requirements of the relevant ISO management system standards. So when we use the term legal register, what do we actually mean and why do organisations need one? A legal register is a document, tool or system that helps organisations to manage their legal compliance. It contains legislation from one particular area, such as a legal register containing environmental legislation or a legal register containing health and safety legislation. The legislation in the register will vary depending on type, size and location of an organisation and what activities they carry out and industries they may operate within. Therefore, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all when it comes to legal registers. The register needs to be bespoke to an organisation and contain the specific legislation that applies to them. A legal register is also a reference tool for checking what compliance duties an organisation has to fulfil to ensure compliance with that legislation, so it can therefore become an audit tool for checking compliance. A legal register should also be updated with changes in legislation. For example, legislation can be amended, new legislation can be published, and legislation can be revoked, meaning it is no longer in force. So the legal register should be kept up to date to reflect these changes. Why should organisations have a legal register? The main reason is that it obviously makes compliance a lot easier to manage, but it is also a requirement of environmental and health and safety ISO standards to understand and have access to your compliance obligations and maintain documented information of this. Now, the ISO standards don't specifically use the term legal register, but this has become the standard terminology for what they require organisations to do. Another reason to have a legal register is that it is much more efficient than just manually searching legislation on a regular basis in sources such as government websites and the HSE, and then having to work out if these updates you've managed to find actually do apply to the organisation. A legal register can form a central resource for people across the business to access who have responsibility for managing compliance. Staff from different areas of the business can use the legal register to understand their specific compliance requirements that they have within their departments. So for the next section of the webinar, in order to show you what a good quality legal register should contain, I'm going to log in to our Legislation Update Service system and go through an example online legal register. The Legislation Update Service can be accessed by going to the compliancepeople.co.uk and clicking on the Sign In button at the top of the web page. For those of you listening that are not current subscribers to the system, we have free trials available should you wish to take a look in more detail. The example good quality legal register that I'm going to show you is an environmental legal register, but you can transfer any of the information over to a health and safety legal register as well. And that is because within the standards ISO 14001 and 45001, the requirements around compliance obligations are exactly the same. So the first part of clause 6.1.3 states that an organisation shall determine and have access to their compliance obligations. So this example legal register contains all the legislation that this organisation needs to know about. The legislation is relevant to them and their activities and the country or countries that they may operate within. It doesn't have any legislation in the register that doesn't apply to them, but also nothing is missing. So the way this is achieved within the Legislation Update Service is completing the Setup button. The register is streamlined, it's efficient, and time isn't being wasted on legislation that does not contain compliance duties for this organisation. And that's an important point to make. it can be easy to err on the side of caution when it comes to legal requirements and put more legislation in there than you actually need. But this ends up being an inefficient process because it's just going to leave you with too much legislation to review. A good quality legal register has to be kept up to date with new and amended legislation, as well as removing any legislation that's been revoked. Within the Legislation Update Service, this happens automatically once a month, and you're told about these changes in two ways. Through the newsletter that's sent at the end of each month, that comes into your inbox, and also through the New in Your Register section. Clicking into this section shows us the changes that have happened to this particular legal register in July. 4 pieces of law within the register have been amended, and by clicking into them, it takes us into that particular entry where I can read that amendment. Scrolling to the Amendments to Legislation section tells me how many times this piece of law has been amended and allows me to keep up to date with changes by reading the amendment. There are several ways that you could prove that you've read this amendment for the purpose of an audit. You could write down in the compliance comments section by adding a new comment that you've reviewed that particular amendment that came out. Or you could save the newsletters within your inbox to show that your auditor what you get through on a monthly basis. Clause 6.1.3, as well as requiring companies to determine and have access to their compliance obligations, they also have to understand how these compliance obligations actually apply to them. So therefore, a good quality legal register has to give an organisation a good understanding of their compliance duties with every piece of legislation that applies to them. This is achieved through the Legislation Update Service by reading the plain English summary and duties that's written by our own content team in every entry. Reading through this information helps an organisation determine what exactly it is they have to do to be compliant with this particular piece of legislation. There's also the ability to document this within the Add Your Own Summary and Duties section. Here, you can write exactly how this piece of law applies to the organisation and what you have to do to be compliant. Because the summaries are in plain English and we've removed any legal jargon, it should be easy to work out exactly which parts of the legislation apply to your organisation and why. If you don't have a legal register within the Legislation Update Service, you're going to have to interpret the legislation directly from the government website. Having access to these plain English summaries helps an organisation to meet the requirement within Clause 6.1.3 to maintain documented information of compliance obligations. Moving on to a different clause within the standards, Clause 9.1.2, Evaluation of Compliance, that requires organisations to evaluate compliance, take action if needed, and retain documented information as evidence of the compliance evaluation results. Therefore, a good quality legal register has documented evaluation of compliance within each entry. And the way you can do that within the Legislation Update Service is by filling in the compliance comments section. Here we have a compliance comment against this entry that documents how this particular organisation is compliant with this piece of law. And this information was determined through doing a compliance evaluation. The comment is time and date stamped, so it creates an audit trail through. And we would look to have a compliance comment for every single piece of legislation that applies to the company. Without the Legislation Update Service, one way you could evidence this evaluation would be to set up an audit template for every piece of legislation that applies to the organisation and document a compliance evaluation within that template. But be aware that could be subject to other requirements of the standards, such as document control, which is Clause 7.5. You may remember when I was talking about Clause 9.1.2, Evaluation of Compliance, I mentioned the words take action if needed. Within the Legislation Update Service, you have the ability to document any compliance actions that need to be taken to maintain compliance, which creates an audit trail for periodic evaluation of compliance. The actions are able to be tracked and have deadlines set and reminders sent to users. By setting deadlines and completing actions, this will show timely closing out of actions, which is something auditors always like to see. You can also manage the actions in one list by scrolling back up to the top and going into the actions section here. Another requirement within clause 9.1.2 is that an organisation has to maintain knowledge and understanding of its compliance status. Within the Legislation Update Service, we have the ability to set the traffic light status for every single piece of law. This provides a visual understanding of compliance status for every piece of legislation using a traffic light function. This particular piece of law has been selected amber because that periodic evaluation of compliance has shown that the organisation is not currently fully compliant with this legislation. So amber's been selected that demonstrates they have a knowledge of their current compliance status. Again, without LUS, you would have to come up with a way to demonstrate the organisation is aware of its compliance status. So you'd have to use some sort of colour coding within a spreadsheet of legislation, for example. But the simplest way is to set the traffic light status within the Legislation Update Service. And you can also see the traffic light status for every single piece of law in the chapter view as well. Another feature of a good quality legal register is that it has supporting information uploaded to evidence compliance with that legislation. Using the attached documents section, we can upload any type of documentation from our own computers into the legal register. Attaching them directly to the entries means it's easier when it comes to reviewing the legislation because the documentation is already there that provides evidence of compliance. They can be managed directly from the entries themselves in this section, or by scrolling up to the top and going to the attached documents list. This allows an organisation to meet the requirements of clause 9.1.2, which is to retain documented information as evidence of compliance evaluation. Another feature of a good quality legal register is that it documents how often legislation is going to be reviewed. And that's because an organisation has to determine the frequency that compliance will be evaluated. So for every entry in the register, we can set the review date. The review function is available on individual entries and also for whole chapters. So this entry has been set to review in 12 months' time, which shows the organisation has thought about how often they want to evaluate compliance with this particular piece of legislation. Another requirement within the standards is that companies have to think about non-statutory compliance obligations or other requirements. If we scroll down to the bottom of the legal register, we have the other requirements section. This section can be utilised for compliance obligations which are not actual legal requirements. We have some examples uploaded to this register, but by clicking on Add Requirement to Site, you can add your own other requirements because these will all be bespoke to your organisation. Clicking into an example shows that it has the same features as any other entry within the legal register, so we can make comments and set actions, upload documents, and set the traffic light status for other requirements like we can other entries of legislation. So let's summarise all the important points I've made while showing you the example legal register to hopefully allow you to implement these qualities in your own legal registers. Each relevant clause from applicable ISO management system standards will show on the slide to help you further. A good quality legal register contains all relevant legislation to the organisation's activities and legal jurisdiction it operates in. The key to this lies in setting up the legal register correctly. A good quality legal register is kept up to date, which happens automatically in the Legislation Update Service once a month. A good quality legal register clearly outlines the compliance duties within each piece of legislation, which is achieved through reading the plain English summaries within each entry. A good quality legal register documents how and why legislation specifically applies to the organisation. Making use of the Add Your Own Summaries and Duties section within each entry helps organisations achieve this. A good quality legal register documents how the organisation complies with each piece of relevant legislation. This is achieved through carrying out an audit of current performance against each piece of law and documenting it within the register. A good quality legal register provides a clear understanding of the organisation's compliance status against each piece of relevant legislation, and this is achieved by setting the traffic light status on each entry. A good quality legal register records ongoing compliance evaluations, showing how often you carry them out and the results of these evaluations. A good quality legal register records actions identified to address any areas of non-compliance or opportunities for improvement in their progress. By setting actions and assigning users and deadline dates for completion, an organisation can monitor their compliance status effectively. Thank you for listening to this webinar, and I do hope that you found it useful and that you can use the information to ensure your legal registers are in the best shape they can be. The Compliance People are the UK's leading provider of health, safety and environmental compliance management services, and we've got lots more guidance and resources available on our website, thecompliancepeople.co.uk. Thank you again for listening.